Lauri Markkanen put pen to paper and signed a long-term deal with the Utah Jazz. What does this mean for Lauri and what's to come for both Lauri and the Jazz? Find out next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin, excited to be back with you guys on Locked On Jazz, filling in for David Locke. You guys know me by now if you're an everydayer, but if you're new, I'm a lifelong Jazz fan, as a credentialed NBA draft analyst for Locked On NBA Big Board, attendee of both the 2023 and 2024 NBA Draft Combine, Utah Jazz broadcast assistant and statistician the past 3 seasons, lover of all things hoops, both college basketball, NBA, and even some of the high school ranks. Of course, I'm watching the Olympics right now, but just because David's not here, don't expect all of the geeky numbers of usual be gone, but I'll bring a unique perspective, knowing a ton about the young players that factor into the Jazz's future, because I've watched a ton of them the last few years when they haven't even been on the Jazz. So I'll bring that perspective and a perspective of an NBA employee the last few years watching Lauri Markkanen up close and personal. So thank you guys for making Locked On Jazz your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is comment anything below. And today's question is, how do you feel about the deal? It's a simple question. Lauri Markkanen signed a long-term extension. Let me know how you feel about the deal. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sport stops sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, in the first segment, we'll talk about the contract. Just the ins and outs of the contract, the nuances, what I like the most about it. The second segment, I'll discuss what I expect from Lauri on an individual basis and for the Jazz this upcoming season. In the third segment, I'll discuss a little bit about the trade talks that are circulating after Lauri's trade talks have died down, as well as just lay out a general guideline for what I expect to take place this season as a team, because I usually want to see growth. Well, you want to see individual growth internally, but you don't want it to equate to wins this year. And that sounds weird, and it is weird, but that I'll outline that in the final segment. All righty, let's dive right in. On Wednesday, Lauri Markkanen signed the most lucrative deal in the history of the Utah Jazz franchise, a renegotiation and extension. That's what it's called, worth $238 million over 5 years, according to league sources. The $238 million is fully guaranteed, and there are no options, no incentives, and no trade bonuses. That's good for the Jazz. It's clear cut. It's dry. For those that are not good at math or haven't thought about the math, it's about $47 million per year. That's a ton. That's just, frankly, a ton of money. But as Andy Larsen said, the value of that contract is not as high as the money screams out to be, and thus is not a monstrous overpay, even though the number is enormous. And you typically, in years past, you'd be like, man, he's not quite as good as some of the guys who've gotten similar. Well, I'll give an example. Jaylen Brown, he's really good. I'd say he's above Lauri Markkanen in the hierarchy, but not by a ton of the best NBA players. He's better. He was the finals MVP for a really good team, but I would argue Jason Tatum's still the Celtics' best player. And that's a number 2 on a championship team. I think many would contend, Tony Jones has been vocal about this, that Lauri is an amazing number 2 for a championship team, and that's what the Jazz need to find, is that number 1. Brown's getting $61 million per year if he reaches his incentives, and $58 million just about without reaching said incentives. What I like most about the Lauri deal is the contract is front-loaded, meaning he's paid the most when the Jazz have the least to play for, in theory, and have the least aspirations to win basketball games in those years. And therefore, they need less help. Lauri needs less help in those years, so there's no one you need to pay that much money. He's locked in with the Jazz, and he's owed the most money at the beginning. I like that. Like, it's a cut-and-dry contract, $238 million. There's more money early, and that's when the Jazz need to give it. So here are the exact numbers. This upcoming season, he'll be paid $42 million, $176,400. And in 2025/2026 season, he'll be paid $46,394,100. It's a ton of money, but that's a set equation of how much he's getting paid. That's front loaded. And then when the last 3 years come into the equation, The Jazz are ready to compete, hopefully. He's paid a controlled total, meaning that it doesn't have to rise based on any of his performances, that is below the max and what will be the max then, because it's only going to jump for the next couple of years. And therefore, the Jazz need less help then at the start. Hopefully, they get their star in a rookie deal. That would be ideal. It would be elite. And then once the Jazz hopefully are in a position to try to contend, then they have their chance to do so with money not being as scarce. Even though he's paid a lot of money, it's not a scarce commodity for the Jazz. It shows the other thing I like about this, and this is from the franchise perspective, not just the Lauri side. It shows the Jazz have a plan with a clear direction, right? You know who their best player is. We've known it the last couple of years, but it wasn't immediately obvious, even to the Jazz entering training camp before his first season. But this year they have a clear direction. Their best player, as currently constructed, is on board and knows and believes in the plan. And he's made that clear. And he believes he's being compensated fairly for it. The Jazz didn't lowball him. Lauri didn't ask for the absolute maximum of what he could have gotten. He got close to it, but the Jazz gave him what he earned in terms of his performance, and the Jazz compensated him fairly, but also they kept a guy who loves Utah, who's been vocal about liking Utah. Not everyone does that. You have 5 years of a very good player's prime, and you have him locked in with no obvious motives to move elsewhere. Yes, Lauri hasn't won yet in his career. Does he want to win? Absolutely. But you have to build to win, and the Jazz had team control. They weren't going to trade him for something they didn't think would help. So now they have to find him that help. The question will be, can the Jazz be bad enough with Lauri on the team to get the guys good enough to take you to the promised land, right? Like, you need to tank to get the talent, or you need to be in a big market and acquire such talent that other teams had tanked for prior. 15 of the 18 teams that have gone through thorough rebuilds have at least come away making the playoffs shortly after. And some of the best teams of late have been built through the draft. And Danny Ainge helped construct the modicum of consistency right now at the top of the game, hitting on 2 picks in the top 10, and in the top 3, in fact, in Jaylen Brown in 2016 and Jason Tatum in 2017, both at 3. I believe the Jazz know the time is now to struggle and hopefully break through later on. Per Tony Jones's article breaking down the Lauri deal on The Athletic, and if you don't read The Athletic, please do, and also Salt Lake Tribune with Andy Larson, they do amazing work, and I try to have them on when I host, and we're on very good terms, and they're great at what they do, and I love interacting with them, and I'm sure you guys do as well on Twitter. So Tony says, the best thing the Jazz can do this season is give plenty of playing time to the younger players on the roster. Markkanen is going to be the centerpiece, but 2 things happen. If the young guys are given priority, the Jazz either lose a lot, which puts them in play for a top 10 pick in next year's NBA draft, or they win more than expected, but they are winning primarily because of the younger players. And that would be a good thing. I agree. If the Jazz are able to find a way to win with younger players, that means the younger players are excellent. I don't think they'll be able to, because the NBA is really good this year, particularly in the Western Conference. He continues to say, whether or not the Jazz win a lot of games this season, Markkanen is good for the roster on and off the floor. He gives Keontae George, Taylor Hendricks, Cody Williams, and the rest of the younger players a peek at what can happen when talent meets an exemplary work ethic. He gives Walker Kessler, Kyle Filipowski, Bryce Sensabaugh, and the rest of the younger players a peek into what can happen when you meet adversity and shake it off and keep moving. So Lauri getting paid and then being back on the roster, the first thing that comes to my mind is, are the Jazz and Lauri going to be bad enough to contend for Cooper Flag? And how does growth happen on the Jazz, even if the goal is to contend in the Cooper Flag sweepstakes? Well, Tony gives you hope there. Like, that's the first thing that my mind wonders. And he gives me some peace of mind saying, well, even if the Jazz don't end up with a number 1 pick, number 5 pick, it would be only because the internal growth of the youngsters are pushing the Jazz so far forward that they're out of that reach. I'd still ideally like to see the growth and be there, but sometimes you can't thread that needle. I think the Jazz actually can, and we'll discuss that next. I love sports, and I love them so much I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like they want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want, and all I have to do is open the app and dream up my bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel/LockedOn and start making the most of your summer. It's amazing. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the Major League Baseball. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. By the way, are you guys watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Well, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, I'm Leif Thulin, filling in for David Locke on Locked On Jazz. Maybe it's the draft nerd in me, but before becoming a draft nerd, I have been a diehard Jazz fan my entire life. I remember videotaping games to watch when I was about 4 years old and taping them over movies. And I would watch Darren Williams' uh, beginning of his career. I watched before Darren Williams with Milt Palacio. Anyway, I want the Jazz to win so badly, so badly. And the best way to do so is through tanking. I think most of us agree now. There were some that said, well, how do you know if you tank that you're going to get a player of the caliber of Lauri Markkanen? You don't. You don't. And that's why people were saying don't trade him. Well, those people, in some of their logic, has won out. The Jazz kept Lauri Markkanen, but they can still tank, and I still think that's the best way to go about it. I've been vocal about that being the best pathway to contention, truly going through the tanking motions, not meeting in the middle, picking 9th and 10th the past 2 seasons where the direction of the team was far from clear, despite signing a top 30 NBA player for the long term yesterday. It appears the Jazz know they need to be bad eventually to be good. And not just good, but very good. And not just bad this year, but very bad in order to get the top of the draft. I believe even with Lauri assuming the health of every team in the NBA, meaning that Ja Morant doesn't get hurt this year and put the Grizzlies in the doldrums of the NBA. If you assume health for everyone, the Jazz and the Blazers are easily the 2 worst teams in the West. Memphis, who was worse last year, gets Ja back. San Antonio gained Chris Paul, Harrison Barnes, Stephon Castle, and they have the internal growth of an alien in Wembanyama. Houston was already good last season. They were 500, 41 and 41. In the East, I think there's some bad teams, no doubt about it. You got Detroit, Washington, Charlotte, Brooklyn, Toronto, Atlanta. They'll be pretty terrible, but they play more games against the less talented Eastern Conference, which gives the Jazz the chance to contend for a top 5 pick without relying on lottery help should they play their cards right. So we'll discuss some more of the team expectations of how they'll get there, what players will play well, who's going to play a lot, some in the next segment. Right now, I want to outline what they'd expect from Lauri Markkanen himself. And if he has big numbers like we expect him to have, the Jazz can be as bad as they'd like to be. How? Like, how does that work? Well, I'll outline it here. Last season, Lauri remained steady and despite being elevated on scouting reports, averaged 23.2 points per game, 8.2 rebounds per game, 2 assists per game on 48% from the field, 40 from 3, 90 from the line. The year prior, his first year with the Jazz, he averaged 25.6 points per game, 8.6 rebounds per game, 1.9 assists, 50% from the field, 39% from 3, and 88% from the line. Firstly, I knew those numbers coming into this because I've done stats for the Jazz both of those seasons. And yet, reading them aloud, do you guys know how absurdly incredible of a shooter Lauri Markkanen is, regardless of stature or shot diet? Then you factor in that he's 7 foot, a freak athlete, plays hard on both ends, shoots difficult shots, is the best player on the team, and therefore is being guarded with an intent to take him out of the ball game. And yet he's been on the cusp of one of the rarest feats in basketball in entering the 50, 40, 90 club back-to-back seasons without good playmakers for 1.5 of the seasons, meaning that Mike Conley's been gone and no one's gotten him easier looks. He's taken on more shots per game, better defense, and a worse roster. That's unbelievable. Like, he is an upper echelon player in the NBA. Without those numbers, you add those numbers in, the rarity of his athleticism, the ability to play 2 ways, his ability to space the floor, play without the ball, and still put up those numbers, both in terms of the percentages, but the prolific nature of his scoring. That's absurd. Like, you're getting a really, really good player. And I think even at times I underestimate him. Like, when I think about those numbers and the projectability of them, knowing the circumstance, watching all of the games, unbelievable. But back to this season. I digress, but Jazz fans should be excited to have this guy for 5 years. I expect his field goal percentage to drop a little bit due to an emphasis on individual scoring becoming highlighted. I think last year at times, there were times where he tried to play in the mid post and he struggled at times. I think there's going to be a continued concerted effort to get him the ball in the high post and see what he can do at elevating over players using his speed. And he's not a great dribbler, but he's got more dribbling than he's been able to demonstrate thus far. And I think he's going to be able to isolate and play more from that fashion in order to try to score the basketball in a more diverse way. And that eventually elevates him to even a better player, brings him up a rung or two in the upper echelon of the NBA. I imagine this year Lauri is going to be a 25-9 guy with slightly dropped shooting numbers. And now the kicker will be, how many games does he sit? That's going to be the question. And because the Jazz need to find clever ways, little loopholes, to find their way into the top of the NBA, top of the NBA draft. I mean, yes, they're going to be bad. They're probably going to be the 14th best team in the West or the second to worst. I actually think it's more likely the Jazz probably are 15th than they are 13th. That's good for what we want long term. It's going to be bad basketball, but that's what it is. Andy Larson the other day on here joined us, and he mentioned a shoulder injury that already exists, which could permeate its way into this season's injury reports. I don't know how early that happens. I think ideally he plays out a bit, and you see him play a lot of basketball early in the season, and then later on down the road, you see him start to miss some games here and there. But I don't think it can just be at the end of the season once there's been too many games won. I think it has to be more frequently used in the early stages of a season to see Lauri Markkanen miss games, or at least limit his minutes. Like I talked about this the other day. When Benyama would play a stint and then he'd sit just an equally long stint. So the Spurs then would make big headway when he was on the floor, and then they'd lose it all when he was off the floor. I'd be okay with the Jazz doing that rather than him blatantly missing games. There's incentives to playing a lot of games. It's not in his contract, but he could be an All NBA guy if everything goes right and he plays enough games. So he wouldn't want to miss that many. And these guys are competitors. Like I said, realistically, the Jazz have too steady of a foundation with Lauri, Will Hardy, Danny Ainge, Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton to be the worst team in the NBA. And as we've seen, it's hard for the Jazz to lose enough under Hardy, which I think is a testament, in my opinion, to his coaching prowess. I mean, the Jazz haven't done anything under Will Hardy, but I think he's been too good to tank as a coach, and the Jazz have found their way to win a lot of games they probably shouldn't have. And that means he's a good tactical coach and a good players coach. And that's my assessment. You guys could disagree, but that's what I genuinely think. Not a team spokesman on this one. I think the Jazz will need to find ways to sit Lauri, and I think he plays 65 games max, which would make him eligible for those All-NBA awards. And maybe the Jazz put him on a minutes restriction, if not outright sitting him. We have to hope the relationship and trust after pouring the money into Lauri long-term remains harmonious, because Lauri is in the longest drought of anyone in the NBA of not making the playoffs. He's played a ton of basketball games and not played in a playoff game. And losing isn't fun, no matter how much money you make. These guys are competitors. So the Jazz, he needs to truly buy into the vision, and the Jazz need to be forthright and tell him, hey, this is what you're going to have this season. Speaking of the entire team and my expectations for the season to come, that'll be next. But I just wanted to read you a little quote from Lauri Markkanen I found on my timeline moments ago. This is talking about his belief in the franchise, and it reminded me. Lauri Markkanen said this to ESPN. They've all showed their belief in me, from the ownership to the front office to Coach Will Hardy. Markkanen told ESPN, it's a comfortable environment, and those guys' resumes speak for themselves. I trust in the organization to help me grow as a person and a player to build our team, and I'm ready to take on the challenge. That inspires me. I believe it. I mean, I know he's saying the stuff you want to hear, but the fact that it's harmonious right now, despite the last 2 years not being clear, the best years of his career at that point, not having a clear direction at the start of the season that finishes the same way at the end of the season, I think the Jazz have came up to Lauri Markkanen and said, we're going to invest in you. We're going to invest in our future, but this is the best way for us to win. We're not ready to do it by shortcutting with a trade. We're going to keep you here. We're going to draft organically, build through the draft, and emulate that of the Thunder, who have a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. That's you, Lauri Markkanen. That you're the Shai to us. Now we need to go get our Chet Holmgren. We need to get our Jalen Williamses. Like, that's what I think the Jazz are going to try to do. So we'll talk about my expectations for the Jazz coming up next. And it'll be interesting. I really think that this year there's going to be a lot of hey, this player's playing well. Let's ride his hot hand, but we can't win too many games. And you'll see some games pulled the plug on. We'll discuss that next. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy day. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and much, much more that can complicate a day, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know it makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. For me, I haven't played much basketball recently, and I miss it. But when it gets busy, the non-negotiables like therapy are even more important. For example, it's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma either, like some may think. It's for everyone. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. All righty, welcome back into Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin. Lauri Markkanen back with the Jazz. The Jazz seem to have a clear direction of not wanting to win this year in order to take one step backwards, two steps forwards. You've heard all this before. I think this is the year the Jazz go all in on it. I said the other day with Andy Larson, I think the Jazz, no matter their effort level after extending Lauri, assuming their roster is as it is right now, the Jazz are the 14th best team in the West with very little wiggle room. I think it's even more likely the Jazz are 15th than 13th. I said that moments ago. I said it with Andy. I truly believe it. But the East has some truly awful teams that they get, but there's a but to this. That means they get to poach wins off of one another because only so many teams can lose so consistently. The East features the Pistons, the Wizards, the Raptors, the Nets, potentially the Hawks and Bulls, and then the Hornets as teams that could be truly awful. That means there are 9 teams that could be truly awful teams in the entire NBA, meaning the Jazz, despite getting a player I ranked 5th in Cody Williams at 10, was in what was deemed to be a poor draft at 10 means I had no faith in the previous Jazz laissez-faire, lack of direction years to get the Jazz to the promised land, aka a top 5 pick in this year's draft. This year, there's a hot commodity. I've heard from good sources that once teams viewed Cooper Flag at Team USA, that they've changed their own directions of the franchise and prerogatives to move their franchise to get Cooper Flag or Dylan Harper or Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, Common Mahlock. I could go on. There's going to be a lot of draft talk when I'm on here on Locked On Jazz because it's going to matter for the Utah Jazz. The Jazz need to play their youth in order to make this happen. So much so that it's probably detrimental to current winning expectations. I believe the Jazz will play Cody from day one, unlike Ochai Agbaji, who already was 22 when he came in when he was the 14th pick. Taylor Hendricks last year was 19, and he was the 9th pick. He played in the G League to start the year. Bryce Sensabaugh played the majority of the year in the G League. I think all 3 of last year's rookies get serious time. Not just, hey, here they are. I think Hendricks starts. I think Sensabaugh plays a lot of minutes off the bench and becomes a guy that they trust to try to score the ball. Whether it's efficient or not, I don't think the Jazz particularly care. They just want to see what growth potential is available. That's what I would do. Keontae George will start. Like I said, Cody Williams, I think he plays from day one. Toss him in the deep end. I believe Kessler's development will be prioritized over John Collins' level of content. That's not easy to balance, but I think John Collins is going to be frustrated, and Walker Kessler was frustrated last year, and this year there's a clear direction. The Jazz don't want to be good, but what would help them be good in the future? Walker Kessler developing, believing in himself further, going back to rookie year Walker Kessler level of belief and confidence. Colin Sexton has a prove-it year. I talked about that a while ago for every dayers who listen to this all the time. You heard me say he's the guy I think has the most to prove for the Jazz. Why? He scored 20 a game. You're crazy. No, my rationale is he needs to prove he's a picture on this team for the future, a guy that factors into the equation. If he's really efficient, as some metrics would lead you to believe, with, say, a poor surrounding cast not helping too much, then maybe it is a great thing, either to elevate his trade stock or to prioritize him for the future. If he can show the ability to score is beneficial to winning basketball games to a team that's actually trying to win. Now, that's something he's never been able to prove. It's not his fault, but you don't know if his scoring translates legitimately to a role that helps you win in playoff games. Colin Sexton, I think, is more ideally suited to being off the bench. That said, he scored 21 points a game on really good efficiency as a starter and 13 points per game on less good efficiency as a bench player. Maybe he just doesn't play well off the bench. He's not a point guard, in my opinion, though he did improve as a passer. So he's got to prove a lot of things in order to say, yeah, I factor in when the Jazz potentially get Cooper Flack with Lauri Markkanen, with and developed Keontae George, with Cody Williams prime years. Like he's got a lot to prove to me. He's going to get every opportunity to prove that this year for the Utah Jazz. Clarkson, I'm going player by player and just kind of spitballing here, but I don't expect him to finish the year with the Jazz. And I would have told you I didn't expect him to start the season with the Jazz. But, NBA's changed. The market value has changed. He's a guy that I thought probably could have been dealt for more than just a pick at the deadline, but picks are becoming a valuable commodity, and you're not seeing many picks being dealt. The Jazz gave up Olynyk and Agbaji and didn't get that much back. Like Clarkson, I would have thought got something, but who knows? Now let's go to Taylor Hendricks. This is a guy who's got a ton to prove. I talked about him and Walker Kessler in that episode. It was Colin Sexton, Taylor Hendricks, and Walker Kessler. The Jazz should play a ton of Taylor Hendricks, who I'll be open about. I have my doubts about Taylor Hendricks. I think at this point he's more theoretical than applied in terms of the 3-and-D value. You expect this valuable player because everyone talks about having a 3-and-D and having prototypical length and switchability, versatility, the ability to hit corner threes. And he shot 39% at UCF, shot 39% as a rookie at the NBA. But I think it's more theoretical than what's applied. He finished the year extremely well shooting the ball when he was a dare shooter. Defensively, the Jazz started the year in a zone because when he was in man, he didn't understand the concepts. He's very raw. Develop him, start him, give him a huge leash, let him guard the best players, see if it's real rather than assume it's not. Prove to yourself that it isn't real in a year that you don't care if you win or not. That's what's got to be prioritized. Can he truly shoot 39% when teams truly want to defend him from the three-point line as opposed to let him shoot the ball? He's got a ton to prove. I expect him to play a lot of minutes. I expect him to start the year starting in the starting lineup. Let him have the huge leash. Now, you asked me about some of the rookies and who else the Jazz have. I do think the Jazz will play a lot of Drew Eubanks, which may impede in Kyle Filipowski's development. But I think there's something to be said for letting young guys grow differently, not tossing all of them in the deep end because not all rooks will float. Not all of them do. I think that it would have been very difficult at times for in the past 2 years for Agbaji to play well at the start of the year. And then I think it was difficult for Sensabaugh at the start of the year. He wasn't in the shape he needed to be defensively. I think it would have been difficult for Taylor Hendricks to play at the beginning, and he didn't. And so that all is important. Filipowski is the type of guy who impressed in summer league with the ball in his hands. If he doesn't have the ball in the hands and he's got to play defense, it might be difficult. You want to put the ball in his hands, develop that confidence. I think he'll bounce back and forth between the Stars and the Jazz. Collier, I think for most of the season, will be running the second unit. I think he plays second unit minutes with Jordan Clarkson a lot this year. And then Jordan Clarkson, if he gets dealt, I think it opens up more time for Isaiah Collier. These are all things I think are very reasonable. I'll be curious to see the management of Collier and Flip, even though Cody, I want them all to play rather than bounce back and forth and have rhythm one time, then not have rhythm. And I think that's hurt Jazz players in the past, but it's also helped them develop confidence. I want to see Cody play from day one because I think he's got the skill set to do so, even if the numbers don't back it up in terms of, you're not going to see a prolific scoring. But I think he's got the ability, the intangibles to play right away. I want to see the other guys play more than just the last 2 months of the season in the big leagues, like you saw with Taylor Hendricks, with Bryce Sensabaugh, like you saw with Ochai Agbaji. I want them to all have the opportunity to play a lot like Keontae George did, because the Jazz have no reason not to play them. There's no reason to impede their growth. And if they're really struggling there, then play in the G League and grow the confidence by playing players that are inferior to that of the NBA competition. In sum, I expect the Jazz to start a solid lineup of Keontae George, who will have a lot of pressure to prove he's the guard of the future. Colin Sexton, Taylor Hendricks, Lauri Markkanen, and Walker Kessler. Kessler over Collins because the Jazz are going to prioritize his growth over Collins' contentedness. This team is adequate if you look at the starting lineup, but it has ineptitude from a few spots shooting the ball and is a poor defensive backcourt. That'll impede the Jazz from actually getting wins, but they'll be able to score enough to stay in a lot of ball games. And now it becomes how good is the bench? How good is the defense? Stuff like that you can't necessarily project without seeing the exact rotations. But the Jazz, if you had to ask me and pencil it in, I think we get about 21 wins. That's what I think. The Jazz will factor in the vets, Collins and Clarkson off the bench, both of whom I think the Jazz want gone and probably they want out too. Collins and Clarkson, they probably want to go elsewhere and try to compete. It'll be hard to raise a trade stock by playing them both off the bench on what factors to be a bad team. That's just the reality of it. But I think someone's going to want Jordan Clarkson's ability to score the basketball. I think the Jazz win about 21 games, like I said, next year. So as Bowler says, buckle up. But in a way, it'll be fun to see the more questions answered than in years past as the youngsters should get real opportunities. Last year and the year before, I was a little frustrated watching the team not have the opportunities to grow and push the Jazz to a real ability to win. Turns out Ochai Agbaji didn't have that capacity. Frankly, wasn't a thrilled with that pick. I know it was the Cavaliers pick, but I remember going on a Cavs podcast, Locked On Cavs, didn't like that pick. He was an older player who really flourished in his senior season. Those guys typically haven't panned out that well. But I would have liked to see him sooner, to have the knowledge sooner rather than plod along in monotony. And it was monotonous because you want him to be good, and all of a sudden he was supposed to be this untouchable trade bait because he had a good last month. You play him the beginning of the next year, and all of a sudden he's out of the rotation. That doesn't bode well. You need to play these guys and learn what you got sooner rather than later. And that's what I believe. And plot along in mediocrity is what I should have said. I think this will give the Jazz the ability to address a lot of questions. Is Taylor Hendricks good enough to factor into the future? Is Colin Sexton a sixth man for the future, or does he have to start? If he answers one of those questions one way, does it answer in a question of how you want to build your team through the future? How good is Cody Williams with the ball in his hands versus not having the ball in his hands? How great can he be defensively? All these things can be answered in part, but more so than you've been able to answer the questions the past two seasons. So that's what excites me, despite needing to buckle up and embrace losing. Not something that's fun for all fans, but you got to do it. That's the way the NBA is right now. The Nuggets even. Jokic, yes, he was the 41st pick. Jamal Murray was the 7th pick. Aaron Gordon, I know he was traded, was the 4th pick. You had Michael Porter Jr. fell to 14. It's picked at the top of the draft. The Thunder, Chet. You have Casey Wallace, number 10. Jalen Williams, number 12. You got all these guys that they're picking high up in the draft that are helping them. Anthony Edwards, Karl Anthony Towns, number one. You got to pick highly to be able to play and compete down the road. Also, I know I said I'd talk about trades, and this will be the last thing. I don't see the Jazz dealing for Ingram, though I will say I do think he has good value for the decreasing price tag, and the value around the league seems to be dropping for him. So he will be a good reclamation project somewhere and exceed probably the amount of money he's going to warrant, as teams don't value his type of player right now as a non-superstar ball-in-hand guy. I think someone's going to get a steal out of that. I just don't think the Jazz are in the position to risk going for Brandon Ingram, paying a lot of money, committing to the future, and plodding along in mediocrity. That's my 2 cents on it. Let me know what you guys think. And just wanted to let you guys know once more, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and it's also now available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Well, that'll do it for me on Locked On Jazz. I'm excited to be back with you guys again soon. With your next watch, check out Locked On Today. You're going to see great sports coverage in every capacity. If you're curious, the Olympics are talked about, the NBA. I mean, Serbia and USA are playing right now. It's awesome, and you can access it in such an amazing multitude of ways. You can watch it on your TV. You can listen to it on a podcast. You can do it in every form you want. Locked On's really on the cutting edge of innovation right now, so I highly recommend it. And yeah, hopefully you guys stay tuned for next week. We got more fun stuff coming up on Locked On Jazz podcast. And as always, when I say it, it's go Jazz. I'm right there with you. So have a good one, guys. And as always, go Jazz.